A human prince entered the throne room. The princess never looked away. Tall columns rose up and spread into a ceiling carved with shapes that shifted when one blinked. The people in the room wore colors the human eye could hardly name. Their skin showed faint lines of light. Their clothing moved without seams. They spoke in a voice that made the air ripple. They were careful and quiet, the kind of quiet that wanted nothing to break it. At the far end of the room sat the princess. She wore a robe that did not cling and did not flow. It seemed to be made of the same calm that sat inside her. Her hands rested on the arms of the throne, but she did not hold the arms as if she needed them. Her eyes were calm and open. Many in the court watched her face. They watched for the tiny shift that would tell them what she thought, and they saw no sign. When the doors opened, the sound the room held shifted. The noise of 100 small conversations dropped like pebbles at once. A human prince stepped in. He smelled different in a way the palace could not name. He walked as if the floor belonged to him for a moment, then as if it belonged to everyone. He was not tall enough to be surprising. He did not shine like a star. He did not move with the strange, floating grace of the court. He moved like a person who had learned to carry his weight honestly. He wore a coat of dark cloth that sat simple on his shoulders. Under it, there was a shirt clean and plain. His boots made a faint sound. His hair lay in a neat line over his forehead. For all his simplicity, something in his bearing made the people in the room take a tiny step back. It was not fear. It was respect in its small form, people making room for a person who did not need to demand it. The council elder leaned forward. He had the habit of watching newcomers like a scientist watches an experiment. He expected the human to be wrong. He had a list of things a human might do that would cause the court to laugh or to be angry. In his mind, the human was a curiosity, a possible problem. He thought the human might bow improperly. He thought the human might speak out of turn. He thought the human might show a rude hand gesture and wreck the afternoon. The human prince did not bow until it fit the rules of the room. He measured his movement like a craftsman measures a joint. He spoke with a voice that filled without pushing. It was clear and calm and slow, like a lake in the early hours. He spoke in the language their court used, but his words sounded a little different. He asked questions that did not tease and did not trap. He named facts plainly and then let the listeners think about them. The princess watched him. She did not look away when others blinked or glanced. Her gaze lay steady on him like wind on a steady branch. She had watched many things in her life, wars decided in 2 words, alliances made across a table, betrayals signed with a symbol this size. She had learned to let her eyes move away when the room asked her to pretend not to see, to let a court decide without her. That day she felt no need to hide. The human moved toward the center of the room where the light pooled like a mirror. He did not seek to be seen as a challenge. He came with a small box in his hands. It was not a gift for the throne. It was not a bomb. It was a simple box made of wood and metal, held together by fasteners that looked improvised and clean at once. He set it down and opened it. Inside, there were small objects tied together with a strip of cloth. When he lifted them out, he showed them to the princess and to the court. They were simple tools from his world. A compass that pointed in a way the court had never felt, a strip of fabric that could warm a hand, a piece of glass like a tiny window. The court murmured. Some moved a hand to hide a smile, others tightened their lips. The elder who watched experiments lifted his brow like a man who had just seen a new color. He scribbled some marks on a pad as if to keep the moment steady. The human prince spoke. He told a small story, a memory of a starship that had once had a leak and the way a cloth had saved a small tool from the cold. He told it with a smile that was not mean and not false. He did not speak of victory or pride. He did not promise power. He spoke of care. The princess listened. The sound of his voice moved in the room like a small wind. One of the court ladies asked quickly how a human prince knew such things. A faint note of astonishment rose in her voice. The prince answered with a simple thing. He had learned them by living. He had learned to fix small problems because in his world, small problems became big ones fast. The court had a word for small problems. They called them errors to be hidden. The human had a word for small problems. He called them things to fix. The next moment a change came that no one had planned. The princess rose from her throne. Her robes did not sound loud. She did not move like a sudden storm. She moved like a thought made small and real. The room held its breath, a sound like silk being drawn tight. The human did not bow. He did not look surprised. He had the calm of a person who had met a challenge before and who enjoyed the meeting. She crossed the space and stood near the human. No one touched her. No one stopped her. The courtiers watched in the way people watch an accident about to happen. They expected a mistake. They expected the human to look away. They expected the princess to turn and walk out. None of those things happened. The princess looked at the human. Her face did not smile, but her eyes made a small, quick light. She asked him why he had come. Her voice was small, but it held the same calm the throne had. The human answered simply. He had come to speak, to learn, and to offer a friendship between his people and hers. He did not speak like a conqueror. He did not sound like a beggar. He spoke like someone who had come to a door and waited until it opened. Some of the nobles shifted in their seats. They had plans. Some thought the princess might use the human to show her wisdom. Some thought the human might be a pawn. The elder scribbled on his pad faster now, more worried. He watched the human's fingers. He watched the way the human kept his hands relaxed. He felt a small fear that the human might be right in ways he did not expect. The princess asked another question then, slow and careful. She wanted to know how he thought of their world. The human looked around at the shining walls and the moving lights. He touched the fabric of his coat. He said simply that their world was beautiful and sharp and wise in its ways. He said his world was messy and loud and warm. He said both were true. He did not say one was better. He said both had things to offer. A courtier laughed softly, but it was not a laugh full of joy. It was the kind of small sound made when something breaks the rules of thought. The human's face did not change. He spoke then of his people, of their ships and their small cities, of how they had to trust one another because space did not forgive mistakes. He said his people had learned to be brave not by fighting but by looking hard at a problem until it had a simple solution. The court listened. Some nodded slowly. Some did not move at all. The princess asked him if his people would accept an alliance with hers. The question held more than a treaty. It held the court's future. The human looked at the princess and then at the room. He said that his people were ready to share knowledge, to trade, and to meet one another on equal terms. He said he did not come to ask for power. He came to share work and to learn. The elder narrowed his eyes. He had not expected such plain answers. He had expected pomp or cunning or flattery, anything that made him feel safe. Instead, he found a man who showed his tools and his thoughts openly. The elder felt a small fear that grew like a shadow. He thought of old stories where strangers came and promised wonders. He thought of the way the princess's father had once trusted a stranger and the court had paid the price. He worried the same might happen again. Other voices rose then, some soft and some sharp. Some of the younger nobles spoke in favor of learning, of curiosity. They said the world must grow and meet new things. The older nobles spoke of caution and history. The room became a place of small waves that crossed one another. None of them looked as directly at the princess as the human did. None matched the clear calm that sat in his eyes. A young aide stepped forward and asked the prince to present what else he had in the box. The prince took out a small device that could hold 3 drops of light. It made patterns like a small map when he opened it. He showed how it could be used to move energy without noise. The court leaned closer as if some secret had been offered. The elder's fingers tightened on his pad. He asked the prince how such things could be trusted. The prince answered that trust was built with time and with clear steps. He proposed small steps: trade at first, exchange of teachers, shared studies. He suggested a group of scholars from both worlds meet in a neutral place. He did not say it as a challenge. He said it as a plan, the way one might outline the parts of a building. His voice was quiet and steady, and the rooms around him felt the shape of logic tighten. The princess studied the prince's face. She could see the small lines of concentration there, the way he thought before he spoke. She felt something like relief. For many days she had felt the weight of rules and old promises. The prince's plain way of thinking was a cool balm. She saw in him a mind that did not hide behind ceremony. She realized his strength was not in overwhelming others, but in making small, practical fixes that kept problems from becoming disasters. The elder still had doubts. He asked about the prince's people. Were they honorable? He wanted to know. The prince answered with a story of a small town that had kept its doors open during a night of cold and found neighbors who were not friends, but turned friendly because of a shared fire. The court listened in a silence that had warmth in it now. The elder lowered his pad and let his eyes pass over the human without the sharpness of a man who expected to win. As the light in the room shifted with the slow motion of the palace, the princess found that she did not want the human to leave. She thought of the future in a way she had not allowed herself for years. She thought of ships tied to strange piers, of children learning words from both their languages, of summers shared under a sky that belonged to no single world. She felt a quiet courage open in her chest. She stepped a little closer to the human and asked him to stay for a while, to meet her scholars and those who taught maps and lights. He agreed with a nod that was small but full. The court murmured anew, but it was the sound of something moving toward agreement rather than away from it. When he left the throne room that day, he did not look like a man who had conquered. He did not look like a man who had been given favor. He looked like a man who had been allowed to lay the first stone of a new wall. The princess watched him go until the doors closed and the light swallowed him. Only then did she let her gaze move across the room, to the faces of those who had watched their world change in the span of an afternoon. Some looked surprised, some pleased, and some wary. The elder had a new line on his forehead, the mark of a man who had met a thought that might change him. The palace quieted. The echo of the human prince's voice hung in the air like a small promise. The princess sat back and let the quiet hold her. She knew the price of hope. She also knew that sometimes hope began with the smallest object: a cloth that warmed a hand, a compass that pointed true, a person who walked into a strange room and did not look away. The palace was quieter now, but not silent. The light shifted slowly across the high walls, bending through the crystal prisms that hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. Courtiers moved with careful steps, talking in hushed tones, voices soft as if they could break glass. The human prince had stayed in the throne room only a few hours, yet the effect of his presence lingered like the faint scent of rain after a storm. People could not stop thinking about him, and some could not stop worrying about what his presence might mean. The princess had returned to her studies, her hands resting on the edge of a low table where maps of distant systems lay spread out. She traced the lines with her fingers, not following the shapes exactly but feeling their flow as one might follow a river. The human prince's words still echoed in her mind. They had spoken briefly before he had left the throne room. Small words, careful words, yet every sentence had a weight she could not name. She realized that he had listened to everything she said and had understood more than anyone else in the court ever had. The day stretched on. Courtiers whispered among themselves, asking questions that had no clear answers. How could a human walk into the heart of their world without fear? How could he speak so plainly, so openly, without showing weakness? The elder, who had studied the histories of every foreign visitor, found himself unsettled. He had not expected a human to act with such precision and such calm. He had expected mistakes, errors, confusion. Yet there had been none. Only presence, intelligence, and respect. In a smaller chamber near the throne room, the princess met with her advisors. They sat around a circular table, its surface smooth and reflective. The room smelled faintly of polished metal and warm air, a combination that always reminded her of evenings spent watching the stars. The advisors, men and women of great experience, spoke quickly, sometimes interrupting each other in their concern. "The human prince is clever," one said, his voice low and cautious. "He does not speak as our people speak. He does not act as our people act. Yet he seems to understand our ways almost immediately. He observes and learns faster than anyone we have ever seen." Another advisor shook her head. "We cannot trust him. Humans are unpredictable. They live by rules we do not follow. They may seem calm now, but their nature is unknown to us. He could bring disaster just by being here." The princess listened quietly. She did not interrupt. She had learned that words alone often did not carry wisdom. Only listening could reveal it. Her gaze moved over the advisors, then toward the window where the sky beyond shimmered with 1,000 floating lights, ships moving in formation as if they were parts of a living constellation. "I do not see fear in his eyes," she said finally, "and I do not see malice. He came to speak and to understand, not to dominate. That is different from any other visitor we have had." The advisors exchanged looks. Some nodded slowly. Others frowned, not fully convinced. The elder cleared his throat and spoke again. "Your Highness, calm does not equal wisdom, but I admit his understanding seems more than ordinary. We must watch him carefully. Every move, every word." Meanwhile, in the palace courtyard, the human prince walked among the alien scholars who had been summoned to meet him. They were cautious at first, speaking in clipped phrases, measuring every response. Yet the human did not act with impatience or offense. He answered questions directly, sometimes with a story from his own world. He described small, ordinary moments: a tool fixed during a storm, a shared meal with friends, a lesson learned from watching children grow. The scholars listened, curious despite themselves. They began to ask more open questions, questions about how humans solved problems, how they learned from mistakes, how they built things that endured despite uncertainty. The prince answered with care, his words simple but clear, his gestures slow and deliberate. He did not show off, he did not argue. He simply explained what he knew, and in doing so, he invited the scholars to think differently. Back in the throne room, the princess observed from a balcony above. She saw how the human moved among the scholars, the ease with which he connected with them despite differences in language, culture, and thought. She felt a quiet admiration growing in her chest. This human, she realized, possessed a quality her world often lacked: the ability to respect others while remaining confident in himself. He could challenge without threatening, teach without condescending, and inspire without demanding. As the day turned to evening, a new concern arose in the palace. Reports came in of a neighboring system preparing for an unexpected council meeting, a gathering of factions that might affect trade routes and alliances. The princess convened her advisors once more. "We must decide how to respond," she said, her voice steady. "Our neighbors will test us. They will look for weakness. I want your counsel." The advisors spoke rapidly, outlining strategies and contingencies. They suggested military displays, careful speeches, and ceremonial gestures. The elder added a note of caution. "We must not appear weak, but we must also not provoke unnecessary conflict. Humans handle such matters differently." "Perhaps we should consider the human prince's perspective." The princess nodded. She had already considered it. "Bring him in," she said. "Let us hear what he thinks." The human arrived in the council chamber without fanfare. He did not bow excessively, nor did he attempt to command attention. He listened first, his eyes moving over the advisors as if noting every expression, every hesitation. When he spoke, it was calm and direct. He suggested methods of communication that were not aggressive but clear, plans that relied on logic and understanding rather than intimidation. The advisors were initially skeptical. Some frowned, muttering about human naivety. Yet as the prince continued, they began to see the merit in his suggestions. His plans accounted for both sides' needs, minimized risk, and opened possibilities for cooperation. The elder, who had doubted him the most, felt a small sense of awe. Here was a man from a world so different, yet capable of thinking in ways that could prevent conflict and build alliances. After the meeting, the princess and the human walked together along a balcony that overlooked the city below. The lights of the streets moved like fireflies, small and numerous, each carrying its own story. She asked him why he believed that understanding could be stronger than force. He smiled slightly. "Because people remember kindness more than power," he said. "Because bridges last longer than walls, and because fear may bring obedience but respect brings loyalty." The princess considered his words. She thought of her people, of the rigid traditions that guided them, of the hidden rules that often led to misunderstanding. She realized that this human prince did not simply speak in a foreign language. He spoke in a language her people had almost forgotten, honesty tempered with patience. In the following days, the human prince continued to meet with scholars, advisors, and even courtiers who had doubted him. Every encounter revealed another layer of his skill. He could solve problems quickly, he could find connections between ideas that seemed unrelated, and he could inspire confidence without demanding it. Slowly, the court began to shift. The air of suspicion that had clung to humans for generations began to loosen, replaced by cautious respect. The princess watched it all quietly, noting the way her people responded. Some were still wary, some were openly skeptical, yet none could ignore the truth. The human prince brought clarity, insight, and a calm presence that her world had rarely seen. She felt a quiet excitement, not of conquest but of possibility. Perhaps there was more to gain from friendship than from fear. Perhaps her people could learn something new, something vital, from someone so different. One evening, the princess and the human met in a smaller chamber filled with plants that glowed softly in the light. The air smelled faintly of earth and water, a smell her world rarely allowed. They spoke of ordinary things, stories of childhood, memories of distant lands, the small wonders of their lives. She noticed that his laughter was quiet but genuine, that his eyes reflected curiosity and understanding. She found herself laughing in return, feeling the ease of conversation without pretense. Word of the human prince's actions spread beyond the palace walls. Merchants, scholars, and travelers spoke of him in quiet admiration. Even those who had been critical began to reconsider their opinions. The human was not seeking fame or power. He was simply himself, and in being himself, he changed the way people saw the world around him. The princess, standing on the balcony one evening, looked out at the city. She thought of the challenges ahead, neighboring systems, potential conflicts, the constant pressure of leadership. Yet for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of hope. The human prince had shown her a new way of seeing, a way that combined courage with wisdom, patience with action. She knew the journey was only beginning. There would be tests, both of her people and of the human prince. There would be mistakes and misunderstandings. But she also knew something else. Humans had a remarkable ability to endure, to adapt, and to inspire. And in that, she saw the possibility of a future her world had never imagined. The palace quieted as night fell, the stars outside shining brightly against the dark sky. The princess remained at her balcony, her eyes reflecting the distant lights. She thought of the human prince, of the calm confidence he carried, of the way he had entered their world and remained true to himself. And she made a small, silent promise to see him not as an outsider but as an ally, a guide, and perhaps something even greater. The human prince's presence in the palace had begun as a simple visit, yet already it had shifted the balance of thought, perspective, and hope. And the princess, who had watched without looking away, understood that sometimes the smallest actions, the softest words, the quietest presence, could have the greatest impact. The next morning, the human would return to the council chamber, the scholars and the advisors, and the work of understanding would continue. And the princess would be there, watching, learning, and quietly guiding the way. In the stillness of the palace, in the glow of distant lights, a new chapter had begun, one written not in force, but in thought, respect, and the unshakable calm of a human prince who had never looked away. The next morning, the palace awoke in quiet anticipation. The sun's pale light spilled across the white and silver walls, making them shimmer as if the entire structure were alive. Courtiers moved swiftly along the corridors, their robes whispering as they passed. Today was different, they all felt it, though none could put it into words. Something had shifted. The presence of the human prince had settled into their lives like a slow tide, leaving ripples that none could ignore. The princess walked along a narrow passage toward the council chamber. She moved with purpose, her robes flowing lightly behind her. Her mind was clear, not with worry, but with thought. She had spent the night considering the human prince's suggestions, his calm approach to problems, and the way he had quietly changed the court's opinion. There were still skeptics among her people, but she saw now that the prince's influence could not be denied. She felt a quiet determination to see how far his wisdom could go. When she entered the council chamber, the human prince was already there, speaking with a small group of advisors. His gestures were calm, deliberate, his voice soft yet strong. He was explaining a method for negotiating with a neighboring system that had a reputation for trickery and strict laws. He outlined a plan that relied not on threats or power, but on understanding the other side's needs, their expectations, and their fears. The advisors listened closely. Some frowned, hesitant to accept advice from a human. Some nodded, seeing the logic in his words. The elder sat at the far end of the table, his face tight with concern. He had studied humans all his life, expecting error, chaos, unpredictability. Yet here was a human whose understanding of strategy, diplomacy, and subtlety seemed almost instinctive. The elder could not explain it, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The princess cleared her throat and spoke. "We must consider the neighboring system's demands carefully. They are likely to test us, but we do not need to provoke them unnecessarily. I want your thoughts." The human prince inclined his head slightly and began. "Their council respects clarity and fairness. If we present a proposal that addresses their concerns while being honest about ours, we can gain their respect without threats. We must focus on solutions that benefit both sides. Showing weakness invites exploitation. Showing openness invites collaboration." One advisor raised a hand, skeptical. "But they may see openness as weakness. How can we be sure they will not take advantage of us?" The prince smiled faintly. "We cannot be sure, but we can be prepared. We anticipate their actions, we understand their culture, and we respond consistently. That is strength." The chamber remained quiet for a moment. His words were simple, yet they carried a weight the room could feel. The princess nodded, approving the approach. She could see the careful lines of thought forming in the advisors' faces. Even the elder, still reluctant, could not deny the logic. That afternoon, a message arrived from the neighboring system. They requested an immediate council, signaling both urgency and potential challenge. The princess called the human prince forward. "You have studied their culture and methods. I want you to advise me directly during this council." The prince agreed, his calm demeanor unchanged. He prepared by reviewing the information carefully, organizing it in his mind as a craftsman organizes tools. He noted the potential conflicts, the areas where compromise was possible, and the points where firmness was required. He did not seek to dominate the conversation. He sought to provide clarity, to guide decisions with reason and honesty. When the council meeting began, representatives from the neighboring system arrived in a grand chamber, their ships visible through the high windows, casting reflections on the polished floors. They were tall, their movements precise, their faces carefully neutral. The room held a tense stillness, the air heavy with expectation. The human prince observed quietly from the princess's side. He watched the representatives, noting their gestures, their patterns of speech, and the subtle shifts in their posture. He whispered a few points to the princess, suggestions on phrasing, tone, and timing. She listened carefully, trusting his insight. The meeting began. The neighboring representatives spoke first, outlining their demands and concerns. Their words were sharp, testing, looking for a sign of fear or overconfidence. The princess answered with composure, stating her people's position clearly and honestly. When the representatives questioned certain points, the human prince suggested ways to clarify without retreating, ways to show respect without yielding. Hours passed. The discussion moved back and forth, tense but measured. At one point, a representative tried to trap the princess with a question meant to expose weakness. The prince intervened subtly, suggesting a response that acknowledged the concern while maintaining authority. The room watched as the conversation shifted, the representatives, sharp tone softening into curiosity. They began to see the logic, the fairness, and the confidence in the responses. By the afternoon, a breakthrough occurred. The neighboring system agreed to terms that were balanced, fair, and respectful to both sides. There was no threat, no force applied, only clear thinking and honest communication. The princess and the human prince had achieved what many thought impossible. They had gained respect without intimidation, trust without compromise of principle. After the meeting, the princess and the prince walked through the palace gardens. The light of the setting sun turned the leaves to gold, casting long shadows along the paths. The princess spoke softly. "Your methods, they are unlike anything I have seen. You achieve results without anger or fear. How is this possible?" The prince looked at the fading sun. "We have learned that lasting solutions come from understanding, not from control. Fear and force can win battles, but they rarely win loyalty or respect. To create something that lasts, we must think ahead, consider the other side, and remain true to our principles." The princess nodded slowly. She understood his words, but more importantly, she felt them. She realized that her world, with all its traditions and rules, could learn from this perspective. She felt a growing admiration for the human prince, not only for his intelligence, but for the calm courage that allowed him to act with honesty in a room full of doubt and suspicion. Over the following days, the human prince continued to work with the scholars and advisors. He suggested new methods of communication, strategies for trade negotiations, and ways to resolve internal disputes without confrontation. Each idea was simple, yet effective. Slowly, the court began to change. People who had doubted him began to follow his guidance, finding their own confidence in the clarity of his reasoning. The princess watched quietly, noting how her people responded. Some were cautious, some enthusiastic, but all were learning to see the world differently. She realized that leadership was not only about making decisions, but also about guiding others to understand and act wisely. The human prince had shown her this, not through words alone, but through action and example. One evening, as the stars began to appear in the sky outside the palace, the princess and the human prince met in a small chamber filled with books and maps. They spoke of the council, the negotiations, and the future. The prince shared stories of human cities, of their customs, of the ways they solved problems through cooperation and thought rather than force. The princess listened, absorbing each detail, considering how it could apply to her people. As they spoke, a sense of possibility grew between them. The human prince's calm presence was a mirror for the princess's own thoughts, reflecting clarity, courage, and determination. She began to see that humans were not only capable of strength, but also of wisdom that could guide even the most complex situations. News of the successful council spread through the palace and beyond. Courtiers, scholars, and even distant observers spoke of the human prince with admiration. They recognized that he had achieved something remarkable, a victory of reason and understanding, a triumph of intelligence and respect over fear and force. The princess felt a quiet pride, not for herself, but for the way her people had begun to change. They were learning to see differently, to consider perspectives beyond their own, and to value the strength of calm intelligence. She realized that the human prince had not only influenced the council but had begun to reshape her world. In the quiet of the night, she stood on the balcony, looking at the city below. The lights twinkled like distant stars, each one a small life, a story, a possibility. She thought of the human prince, of his calm voice, his steady hands, and the way he had guided them through challenge without conflict. She understood that the future could be different, better, brighter, and more just, if they continued to follow the path he had shown. The palace, once filled with tension and doubt, now held a new energy. There was curiosity, there was respect, and there was hope. And the princess, who had never looked away from the human prince, felt a quiet certainty that their journey together was only beginning. The human prince's presence in the palace had grown from a simple visit into something larger, something transformative. His wisdom, patience, and calm courage had begun to change not only the decisions of the council, but the way people thought and acted. And the princess, watching and learning, knew that this influence would continue to grow, shaping her world in ways she had never imagined. As the night deepened, the palace quieted. The stars above shimmered like distant beacons, and in their light the princess made a silent promise to continue learning, to continue observing, and to support the human prince as they faced the challenges yet to come. For she understood now that true strength did not always come from power or force, but from the quiet courage to act wisely, to speak honestly, and to guide others with respect and understanding. The following days would bring new tests, new negotiations, and new opportunities. Yet the princess faced them with a calm heart, knowing that the human prince would stand beside her, not as a conqueror, not as a stranger, but as an ally, a guide, and a mirror of the wisdom and courage she had long sought. And in that certainty, the palace and the world beyond felt the first light of a new era. The sun rose slowly over the palace, spilling a soft, golden light across the high towers and crystal windows. It was a morning like any other, yet for the princess and the human prince, it carried the weight of possibility. The palace had changed in subtle ways since his arrival. Courtiers whispered less in fear and more in curiosity. Scholars lingered over their studies, inspired by new ideas. The air itself seemed lighter, filled with a sense that something important was unfolding, though no one could yet name it. The princess moved through the corridors with purpose, her robes brushing the polished floors. Her mind was alert, thinking ahead to the council meeting that awaited them later in the day. Reports had arrived overnight. A faction in a distant system was challenging her rule, questioning her authority and threatening trade alliances. Normally, such news would bring anxiety, but today she felt steady. She knew the human prince would guide her, as he had before, and that his wisdom could turn tension into opportunity. The human prince was already in the strategy room when she arrived. The room was circular, lined with screens showing maps of the systems and streams of data. Scholars and advisors gathered around, waiting for instructions. The prince stood quietly, observing the information, making notes in his small journal. His calm presence gave confidence to those who had followed him for days, and curiosity to those who were still skeptical. The princess stepped forward and spoke. "This faction has challenged our authority. They question our trade and demand concessions." I want a plan that protects our people, preserves our resources, and maintains our alliances." The prince nodded, his eyes moving over the maps. "We can address their concerns directly without giving up what is ours. We need to understand their priorities and then find a solution that benefits both sides. Force will create resentment, reason will create loyalty." One advisor frowned. "They may not see reason. They are aggressive. They expect weakness or intimidation." The prince smiled faintly. "Then we prepare for their expectations without letting them control our actions. We act with clarity and fairness. That will surprise them and earn their respect." Plans were laid out carefully. The prince suggested sending a message first, a proposal that acknowledged the faction's concerns while clearly stating the needs of the princess's people. It was written simply, without arrogance, without submission. It invited dialogue, not conflict. The scholars who had once doubted him found themselves nodding, impressed by the clarity and foresight in his strategy. By midday, the message had been sent, and the court awaited a response. The princess stood beside the prince, watching the skies through the tall windows. Ships moved in the distance, and the palace seemed to hold its breath. A sense of anticipation filled the air. Every courtier knew that the next few hours could decide the balance of power for years to come. When the response arrived, it was unexpected. The faction had sent a delegation, agreeing to meet in person. They did not threaten, they did not demand, but they also did not show fear. It was clear they were testing the princess and the human prince to see if they could be challenged or outmaneuvered. The princess called the council to the chamber. The human prince prepared by reviewing the facts, anticipating questions and objections, and considering the delegation's cultural norms. He advised the princess on how to present their case, clearly, honestly, and with respect. He reminded her that showing calm confidence was as important as the words spoken. The chamber was filled with representatives from the distant system, their ships visible through the crystal walls. They were tall and proud, moving with precision. The human prince stood beside the princess, a figure of calm observation. When the delegation spoke, he noted every gesture, every pause, every subtle expression. He whispered small reminders to the princess, guiding her responses with careful thought. The discussion began cautiously. The delegation outlined their grievances, testing the princess's authority, expecting hesitation or misstep. The princess spoke with clarity, presenting facts and solutions. When the delegation tried to push her into concessions, the prince suggested ways to redirect the conversation, to acknowledge their concerns without weakening their position. His words were subtle, almost invisible, yet they shaped the course of the dialogue. Hours passed. The chamber grew tense at times, but the human prince's calm influence never wavered. The delegation realized that the princess and her advisors were not acting out of fear, nor were they seeking dominance. They were thoughtful, prepared, and honest. Slowly, the sharpness in the delegation's tone softened. Questions became discussions, challenges became suggestions, and skepticism became curiosity. By evening, the meeting reached a breakthrough. The delegation agreed to terms that were fair and balanced. Trade agreements were maintained, alliances strengthened, and the faction's concerns addressed without compromise to the princess's authority. The room erupted in quiet satisfaction. Scholars exchanged looks of surprise and admiration. Courtiers, once skeptical, whispered praises of the human prince's insight. The elder, who had doubted him most, sat back with a small smile, feeling the weight of his own surprise. The princess and the human prince walked through the palace gardens afterward. The soft glow of lamps illuminated the paths, and the air smelled faintly of flowers and earth. The princess spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Your guidance, it is unlike anything I have seen. You achieve resolution without anger, without force. How can this be?" The prince looked at the glowing lamps, his eyes calm. "Because solutions that last are built on understanding, not fear. Force may bring obedience, but it cannot bring trust. Respect is earned through clarity, patience, and honesty. When people see that you act with fairness and thought, they follow willingly. The princess considered his words. She thought of her world with its traditions, rules, and expectations. She realized that humans, though different, possessed a kind of strength that complemented her own. A quiet courage, a calm intelligence, and the ability to inspire without domination. She felt a growing admiration for the human prince, not only for his skill but for his character. Over the following days, the palace transformed further. Courtiers became more thoughtful in their actions, scholars more curious in their studies, and even distant systems spoke of the human prince's wisdom. The princess noticed how her people had begun to trust themselves more, inspired by the example set by the prince. His presence had not imposed change. It had guided it, subtly and effectively. One afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the palace halls, the princess met the prince in a quiet chamber lined with books and instruments. They spoke of the recent council, the negotiations, and the challenges ahead. He shared insights from his world, methods of learning, problem-solving, and cooperation that had helped humans thrive despite uncertainty and adversity. She listened carefully, absorbing every detail, considering how it could strengthen her people and her rule. As they spoke, a sense of partnership grew between them. The princess realized that the human prince was not merely an advisor. He was a collaborator, a mind she could trust, and a companion in navigating the complexities of leadership. She felt a quiet joy in this realization, a sense that together they could face challenges with wisdom, courage, and understanding. The human prince, too, recognized the princess's abilities. He saw her intelligence, her strength, and her capacity for vision. He admired the way she balanced tradition with progress, authority with empathy. In his own quiet way, he began to see her as more than a ruler. She was a leader who could shape her world for the better, guided by reason and fairness. Word of the successful negotiations spread beyond the palace walls. Traders, scholars, and even distant observers spoke of the human prince's wisdom and the princess's decisive leadership. They recognized that the outcome was achieved not through force, but through thought, clarity, and cooperation. Respect for humans grew, as did admiration for the princess's judgment in accepting the guidance of someone from another world. One evening, as stars filled the sky, the princess and the human prince stood on a balcony overlooking the city. Lights shimmered below like a field of tiny stars. The princess spoke softly, almost to herself. "We have faced challenges without violence, without fear. Yet we have succeeded. Your presence, it has changed more than the council, more than the palace. It has changed the way we see the world." The prince nodded, his gaze calm and steady. Because change begins with understanding. When people see clearly, they act wisely. When they trust themselves and one another, even great challenges can be met without harm. The princess smiled faintly. She felt a quiet certainty settle within her. Together, they had begun something remarkable, a future shaped by intelligence, patience, and respect. She understood that leadership did not require domination, and strength did not require force. The human prince had shown her that courage could be quiet, yet undeniable, and wisdom could be gentle, yet transformative. As night deepened, the palace became still. The princess remained on the balcony, her eyes on the distant lights. She thought of the journey that lay ahead, new alliances, new challenges, and the constant responsibility of leadership. Yet she felt ready. She knew the human prince would continue to guide and support her, not as a master, not as a stranger, but as an equal partner. The next day would bring new meetings, new negotiations, and new decisions. Yet the lessons of the past days remained clear. Clarity, honesty, respect, and calm courage could achieve what fear and force could not. The princess understood now that humans were remarkable not because of strength alone, but because of their ability to think, adapt, and inspire. The human prince's influence extended beyond the council chambers, beyond the palace walls, into the hearts and minds of those who had witnessed his wisdom. People spoke quietly of the changes they had seen, the calm confidence he brought, and the way he guided action without demanding obedience. Respect for humans grew, and with it, hope for a future that was fairer, brighter, and more just. The princess stood beside him, feeling the weight and possibility of what they had achieved. She knew there would be more challenges, but she also knew that together they could meet them. They had proven that reason could guide decisions, that understanding could replace fear, and that courage could shine without violence. And in the quiet of the palace under the stars, a new era began, an era shaped not by power alone, but by wisdom, respect, and the unshakable presence of a human prince who had entered a world without fear and remained true to himself, inspiring a princess and her people to see a brighter future. The palace slept peacefully that night. Outside, distant stars reflected the light of possibility. Inside, the princess and the human prince prepared for the days ahead, ready to guide their people with courage, understanding, and the quiet strength of a partnership that would shape generations to come. A human prince entered the throne room. The princess never looked away.